Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are strapping on our mental armor, maybe setting our philosophical compass, and traveling back to a moment of really intense cultural and, well, spiritual combustion. Early 17th century Protestant Germany.
Yeah, it's a fascinating period. This was a place and time just crackling with religious anxiety. You had the looming threat of war and this revolutionary fever for scientific discovery.
Right. The world felt simultaneously kind of broken and maybe on the verge of something new. Enlightenment, perhaps.
It was a truly volatile mix. You had the rigid structures of the old church, the old university sort of crumbling, but nothing quite ready to take their place.
And into this vacuum, this intellectual powder keg really dropped a stack of short, anonymous pamphlets, and these promised nothing less than total global renewal.
Exactly. That's what makes them so explosive.
That's right. So our mission today is an in-depth exploration of these three texts, known collectively as the Rosicrucian Manifestos. They appeared anonymously between 1614 and 1616. This deep dive has to do three things for you, our listener. First, understand the revolutionary kind of utopian content of the texts themselves. What do they actually say? Second, understand why they caused this continental earthquake, a furor, as the historians call it, that captivated, terrified, and frankly, divided Europe.
A huge reaction, yeah.
And third, we really need to analyze how this idea of an invisible brotherhood became this, well, indelible template for practically every secret society, occult organization, even conspiracy theories that followed.
It's a powerful idea. The core promise of these manifestos was the universalis reformatio, the general reformation of all human knowledge.
Not just religion, then.
Oh, far beyond just reforming theology. This was aiming for total synthesis. They aimed to fuse deep European mysticism, Hermeticism, Jewish Kabbalah, with radical new empirical science, specifically the alchemical medicine of Paracelsus, and all framed within a profoundly reformed Protestant agenda.
So they weren't just trying to fix the church or fix the state. They were trying to fix the cosmos itself by proposing a whole new way of seeing the world.
Exactly. We are looking at a pivotal historical moment. You could call it the last, most brilliant, and maybe most tragic attempt to stop that schism, the split between faith and reason.
The split between the magical thinking of the Renaissance and the colder, rational modern age.
Right. Before that schism just tore Western thought irreversibly apart. This was a final attempt to hold it all together.
Okay, let's begin right at the beginning then, with the shockwave itself. The sources all emphasize this dramatic, almost instantaneous appearance of the texts, issued anonymously from Kassel, Germany, starting in 1614.
And this was a programmatic call. The authors immediately established their ambition was way greater than anything that had come before.
Bigger than Luther, even.
Well, the initial Protestant Reformation, spearheaded by Luther, largely focused on theology, church structure. The Rosicrucians, though, they aimed higher. They wanted to heal all of Christianity and, crucially, overthrow what they pretty contemptuously called sterile philosophy.
Meaning the universities.
Exactly. They targeted the entire academic infrastructure that was propping up the old world.
So the first text, the Fama Fraternitatis, the report of the Brotherhood, basically, that was the foundational myth.
That's the one. It dramatically announced the existence of this mysterious organization, the Brotherhood of the Rosy Cross. And what's really fascinating is the timeline they claimed.
Oh, yeah.
They asserted the Brotherhood had been founded a full century earlier.
100 years before they announced themselves. Why?
Well, that 100-year gap is definitely not arbitrary. It meant the Brotherhood theoretically predated the Reformation itself.
Ah, okay. So it gives it this kind of status outside the whole Protestant Catholic fight.
Exactly. It claims a kind of primordial authority. They declared that this group, possessing this all-encompassing, divinely sanctioned knowledge, was now finally ready to share it with a Europe they hoped was, worthy and responsive.
Oh.
But, and this is the genius move, they were invisible.
That invisibility is the first masterstroke, isn't
Yep.
it? They provided no physical address, no list of members, no way to actually contact them publicly.
Oh.
It just set the stage for the entire phenomenon.
Absolutely. And that invisibility is really rooted in this detailed, quite elaborate founding myth of their leader, Frater CRC Christian Rosenkreuz.
Right.
The Fama is just this magnificent piece of allegorical writing. It's designed to create instant historical legitimacy for what was really a revolutionary philosophy. CRC is introduced as a German noble who early in his life decides that the established, scholastic education of Europe is entirely insufficient, spiritually bankrupt even.
So he goes on a quest. like a
Yeah.
classic medieval thing, a pilgrimage to gain wisdom.
He does, but the route he takes is highly specific, and for the time, highly controversial. He's diverted immediately away from the typical Holy Land sites people would expect.
Where does he go instead?
His journey takes him to Damascus, a known center of Arab learning and medicine, then to the mythical city of Damkar, often placed vaguely in Arabia, where he supposedly masters the hidden arts, and finally to Fez in Morocco.
Fez. That was a big center for Jewish and Arabic learning, right? Math, astronomy, magic.
Precisely. This is a deliberate philosophical statement they're making through his itinerary.
What's the statement then? What does that journey symbolize?
Well, by establishing the Brotherhood's origins in these centers of Islamic and Jewish intellectualism, the myth immediately signals that the knowledge CRC acquired was a synthesis, something far superior to the, ossified Christian academic world.
So it's a fusion of practical, observed physics, traditional magic, spiritual wisdom, the more perfect knowledge they talk about.
Right. He wasn't just presented as a Christian mystic, he was a kind of universal sage.
And when CRC brings this enlightened universal knowledge back to Europe, he's rejected.
Yes, completely. Universal rejection. The European academics, the masters of the established universities, they're painted as the villains of the story.
How are they described?
Arrogant, blind, so utterly mired in the unphilosophy of Aristotle and Galen that they just refuse to accept this new synthesis. They prefer their dusty old textbooks to CLC's observed applied wisdom.
So what does he do? He forms the fraternity.
Exactly. He forms the original secret fraternity back in Germany.
And they bind themselves by strict rules, I imagine.
A very powerful oath, yes. They swore to heal the sick for free, which is significant, maintain absolute secrecy to protect their work and themselves, and very pragmatically find replacements for themselves, this idea of co-optation, to ensure the fraternity's survival across generations.
Okay, that makes sense, which sets the stage for the big narrative centerpiece of the Fama, this hidden vault.
Ah, the vault, yes.
CRC dies, supposedly, and 120 years later, after this first cycle of secrecy is complete, the current generation of brothers finds and unseals his hidden seven-sided tomb.
The description of this structure is probably the most enduring image from the manifestos. It's amazing. The text is really careful to state this is not a grave, it's a living repository of knowledge.
Seven-sided. That sounds significant.
Oh, deeply. 7 is steeped in mystical significance. The planets, the days of creation, the stages of alchemy, and the vault is illuminated by an ever-burning lamp, a kind of little sun that requires no external fuel.
Wow. And inside?
Inside, CRC is perfectly preserved, holding the Book T, a scroll supposedly containing the entire secret wisdom of the Brotherhood.
So what's the real significance of the vault, symbolically?
Well, it serves multiple functions. On a practical level, maybe it guarantees the historical lineage of the wisdom, right? But symbolically, it's this profound statement about the Rosicrucian system itself. The vault symbolizes a complete, self-sustaining compendium of the universe. The ever-burning lamp signifies that the perfect, unified, knowledge-fusing science and spirit is already whole. It's always been there, just hidden beneath the surface of the world, waiting for the worthy to discover it.
So the path to reformation is internal discovery, not creating something new.
That seems to be the implication. Yes. It suggests the answers are already within reach, if you know how to look.
And it's this discovery that prompts the call. The Fama ends by inviting the learned men of Europe, those who recognize the need for this profound reformation, to respond.
Right, and this is where that sorting mechanism really begins. The invitation is, cryptic. Respond to the offer of general reformation, not by, writing letters to an address that doesn't exist.
There isn't one.
Exactly. But respond through printed works.
Ah, so anyone who responds has to be literate, has to be capable of philosophical discussion, and, crucially, willing to go public with their interest in this potentially revolutionary idea.
Yeah. Precisely. It was a public announcement that cleverly doubled as a sophisticated filter for intellectual alignment. You had to put your reputation on the line.
Okay, so the Fama established the myth, the story, the invitation. But just a year later, 1615, we get the Confessio Fraternitatis, the concession of the Brotherhood. Now, the sources describe this one as the aggressive philosophical defense. So the tone changes.
Oh, dramatically. If the Fama was this, inspiring allegorical narrative, the Confessio is more like an apocalyptic manifesto. It's marked by a much more strident, sometimes quite arrogant, and fundamentally anti-establishment message.
More aggressive.
Definitely. The authors clearly felt the urgency of their mission, and maybe the need to declare intellectual war on their opponents.
And the primary opponent isn't just the Catholic Church, although they definitely condemned the Pope as the Antichrist, using that standard radical Protestant language of the time.
No, although they do that very loudly. The primary target is the intellectual status quo itself, the academic world.
Right. They issued what to the entrenched university masters of the time must have been a shocking, almost, blasphemous condemnation of the entire intellectual order.
Pretty much. Their specific target was the very foundation of all European higher education at the time, Aristotelian philosophy.
Aristotle.
Yes. The text declares the heathen Aristotle, whose metaphysics and logic underpinned basically all medieval and early modern learning, to be a godless impediment that needed to be altogether rejected.
Wow. Why was rejecting Aristotle so incredibly radical?
Because for centuries, the established, approved way of getting knowledge was scholasticism, which was based on interpreting Aristotle. Aristotle provided the framework for logic, physics, even medicine, indirectly through Galen.
So attacking Aristotle was attacking the very method of thinking.
Absolutely. The Rosicrucians were essentially saying, tear down the lecture halls, burn the classical textbooks, and start over. Base everything on nature.
Okay, but they weren't just tearing down. The Confessio had to offer a replacement, right? What was their more perfect philosophy?
Well, it's highly syncretic. It combines three distinct strands. First, what they called true magic, which they were very careful to distinguish from the demonic sorcery their detractors accused them of.
Okay.
Second, the mystical Jewish tradition of Kabbalah, which was used to understand God's relationship with creation through divine emanations and so on. And third, crucially, the medical and alchemical philosophy of Paracelsus.
Paracelsus.
Yeah.
So it's fair to say then that the manifestos basically took the Paracelsian revolution, which was already happening, and kind of weaponized it, turned it from just a medical school of thought into a total program for universal reform.
That is the essential insight, yes. Paracelsus Theophrastus von Hohenheim. He'd been this massive disruptive figure in medicine for decades already. People called him the Luther of medicine.
Why?
Because he was constantly challenging the medical orthodoxy of Galen, which was all based on the four humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. That Galenic system, tied to Aristotelian physics, was visibly failing in many areas.
And the Rosicrucians just grabbed onto Paracelsianism.
They embraced it wholesale. And they defined their project using its three core pillars.
Okay, let's detail these pillars because they really show the full scope of the Rosicrucian challenge. What's the first one?
The first pillar is empiricism, or as the Paracelsians often termed it, the direct observation of the book of nature.
The book of nature.
Yeah, the idea was that God wrote two infallible books, the Bible and nature. Scholars were obsessed with the Bible, but they largely ignored nature. Paracelsians demanded direct experience, observation, even dissection, rejecting that total reliance on ancient written authorities like Galen or Avicenna.
So a big methodological shift towards what we'd now call experimental science, maybe.
In a way, yes. It's a precursor, very important shift.
Okay, pillar number 2. This seems central. Chemical philosophy.
Absolutely central. This is what made them so radical. Chemical philosophy asserts that the universe and the human body, the macrocosm and the microcosm, they do not operate based on humors. They operate on alchemical principles.
Specifically,
The tria prima: salt, sulfur, and mercury. Salt gives the body substance, its structure. Sulfur gives it combustibility, its soul, its energy. And mercury gives it volatility, its spirit, its life force.
So disease, then, isn't a humoral imbalance.
It's a chemical imbalance, exactly.
And the practical medical implication of that, what does it mean for treatment?
It means medicine must be based on chemical remedies. They were pioneers in using specific mineral and chemical compounds, things like antimony, distilled metals to treat diseases, a complete departure from the standard herbal remedies and bloodletting of Galenism.
Revolutionary. And probably dangerous sometimes.
Oh, definitely dangerous, but also often quite effective, which made their medical claims really powerful and persuasive to many.
Okay. And the third pillar ties it all together. Mysticism.
It does. Paracelsianism insisted on the absolute integration of natural philosophy, what we'd call science, with a mystical, reformed Christianity. For them, science wasn't separate from faith. It was a spiritual, even a devotional act. Well, the search for the Philosopher's Stone, for example, was simultaneously the pursuit of chemical perfection and the achievement of spiritual, maybe even Christ-like transformation.
I see.
So the Rosicrucian system, therefore, presented the Brotherhood as possessing this divine, comprehensive Paracelsian science revealed by God himself to usher in the end times. It demanded that people view the world, their bodies, and their faith through this singular, unified, alchemically inflected lens. It was a total worldview.
Okay, so the first two manifestos, the Fama and the Confessio, they lay out the theory, the myth, the philosophical framework. But the third text, published in 1616, The Chemical Wedding of Christian Rosenkreuz, is dramatically different. It's not a declaration, it's more like an elaborate, detailed, allegorical romance, almost a novel.
Yeah, it reads very differently. And importantly, unlike the first two anonymous ones, this one actually names its author, Johann Valentin Andreae.
Andre, we'll come back to him. So this distinction is important for understanding their real intent.
It's paramount, I think, yes. The wedding is presented as CRC's spiritual autobiography, detailing his mysterious experience over a symbolic 7-day period. It is dense, bizarre, beautiful, really strange stuff.
7 days again, why 7?
The structure is highly deliberate. It parallels the 7 days of Genesis cosmic creation and, maybe more importantly on the esoteric level, the 7 distinct stages of the alchemical great work, the opus alchemicum.
The process of turning base matter into the philosopher's stone.
Exactly. So if the manifestos were the theory of Reformation, the wedding is like the detailed instruction manual for individual internal praxis, how you actually do it.
Okay, so tell us a bit about the symbolism of the quest.
Yeah.
CRC gets a mysterious invitation.
Right, he receives a call to attend a royal wedding, but it's clearly a spiritual invitation, not a literal physical one. His journey takes him to this fantastical multi-level castle, and immediately the candidates who arrive are subjected to these complex symbolic trials. Well, the famous weighing of souls, where they are literally placed on scales to determine their spiritual readiness, their worthiness, basically, before initiation can even proceed.
So it reinforces that filtering function we saw in the Fama. Only the worthy get through.
Precisely. You have to prove yourself spiritually fit.
The allegorical events sound incredibly complex, but the sources highlight one central, really jarring symbolic event: the ceremonial beheading of the royal bride and groom. That seems shocking for spiritual text.
It is shocking, and it's absolutely meant to be. This symbolizes the alchemical stage of negredo, the blackening, or the death of the old self.
The death of the self.
In a spiritual context, yeah. The seeker CRC, and by extension the reader, has to witness and, in a way, participate in the dissolution of the corrupt, worldly, or just ill-formed self. Before true spiritual enlightenment can happen, the ego, the false knowledge inherited from that old Aristotelian world, it all has to be ritually destroyed.
Okay. And after this dissolution, this death, there's a resurrection.
Exactly. CRC assists in the subsequent alchemical work, this complex distillation and purifying of the remnants of the royal couple. This leads through the phases of purification, the albedo or whitening, and then perfection, the rubedo or leadening.
Like the stages of alchemy.
Just like the stages. And this symbolic work results in the couple's resurrection, reborn, and purified. CRC's reward for participating in this redemptive work is being crowned a Knight of the Golden Stone.
Golden Stone, a reference to the Philosopher's Stone.
Almost certainly. It signifies his spiritual achievement, his mastery of the great work within himself.
So the message is really clear. The General Reformation isn't primarily an external political change, but it's the inner, spiritual, psychological transformation of the individual seeker.
That's the synthesis, yes. The chemical wedding basically functioned as a coded instruction manual. It taught that if you want to find the invisible college, you first have to undertake this rigorous, self-destructive, and ultimately reconstructive process of alchemy on your own soul.
Which brings us right back to the function of invisibility. If the goal was such a profound reformation, why risk being ignored or misinterpreted by refusing to give out an address? The sources suggest this was a deliberate sorting mechanism and maybe even a sophisticated act of self-preservation.
Well, it definitely served the practical purpose of deniability, right? During a time of intense political and religious upheaval, you can't persecute a club you literally can't find.
Plausible deniability.
Exactly. But its philosophical function was that filter. If a seeker was driven by greed, just seeking worldly gold or secret magical powers, the puffers, as alchemists contemptuously called them, they'd be frustrated immediately. They'd drop out, concluding the Brotherhood was just a myth, non-existent.
So only those who got the deeper message, who understood the allegorical nature of the call, that Reformation required internal, intellectual, spiritual preparation, only they would persist.
That seems to be the idea. To contact the Brotherhood, you had to effectively become a Rosicrucian internally first, having already done the kind of alchemical work detailed in the Chemical Wedding.
So the manifestos didn't exist to attract members to a club.
No. They existed to create members out of existing worthy individuals who were ready for that transformation.
Okay, this leads us straight to the authorship enigma and this crucial concept of the ludibrium. Modern scholarly consensus seems pretty firm now, right? That the manifestos were a collective intellectual project of the Tübingen Circle at the University of Tübingen, including André, who wrote The Wedding, Tobias Hess, Christoph Besold.
Yes, that Tübingen connection is well established. This was a group absolutely steeped in millenarianism, end times thinking, and the radical ideas of Paracelsus. They genuinely believed a new age was imminent and urgently needed a catalyst.
But the puzzle lies in what Andrea said later in life, after the 30 Years' War started and kind of shattered those utopian hopes.
Right. Andrea eventually claimed that the original Brotherhood, the whole setup, was a ludibrium.
And we absolutely have to correct the common mistranslation of that Latin word. It's so often rendered as just a mere joke or a hoax.
Yeah, that translation misses the point entirely. In the humanist tradition that Andrea was part of, ludibrium meant something more like a serious game or play with a purpose. Think of it as a pedagogical device, a carefully constructed fiction used deliberately to teach a profound, often critical truth. Intellectual satire with a moral goal.
Okay, so the ludibrium, the joke, or the fiction, was the physical organization itself. The literal centuries-old club with Freighter CRC wasn't meant to be real.
That seems to be what André meant, yes. But the serious purpose, the deep truth behind the game, was the ideal of the General Reformation. The authors constructed the myth of the invisible college as a calculated catalyst. They were almost like performance artists, using print media and allegory to provoke intellectual and spiritual change in a desperate age.
And the tragedy, the great miscalculation, was that the public became pathologically obsessed with the joke, chasing the invisible literal brotherhood, and almost entirely ignored the serious purpose.
That's the deep irony. They ignored the urgent call to intellectual and spiritual self-reform. They wanted the secret club, not the difficult cosmic homework.
The huge reaction the manifestos caused really underscores how perfectly timed they were. They just tapped right into the cultural and intellectual landscape of early 17th century Germany. The soil was incredibly fertile for these kinds of radical ideas.
Oh, absolutely. You have to understand the atmosphere.
Let's look closer at those unique currents that made these pamphlets go, well, viral in today's terms. We mentioned the intense millenarian hopes. Can you elaborate a bit on that apocalyptic expectation?
Yeah, this wasn't just generalized anxiety about the future. This was specific theological expectation, especially strong in Protestant circles. People genuinely believed the world was approaching its final decisive age.
The end times were near.
Many thought so. The 1590s and 1600s saw this massive increase in prophecy interpretation and widespread anticipation centered around this concept of the Elias Artista.
Elias Artista?
Yeah, a kind of prophetic figure or maybe a group who was expected to be revealed in the end times to deliver God's final secrets, especially secrets concerning alchemy and the redemption of nature itself.
And the manifestos just jumped right onto that bandwagon.
They capitalized directly on this fervor.
Yes.
By positioning CRC and his Brotherhood as possessing this final universal science, the divine alchemy, they deliberately signaled, hey, we are the fulfillment of the Elias Artista prophecy.
So they were offering intellectual and spiritual salvation wrapped up in a scientific program, promising a golden age right before the final judgment.
Pretty much. It was a powerful mix.
We also need to stress the importance of this syncretic third way they offered. They were Protestant and definitely anti-papal, yes, but they were also quite hostile toward their own Protestant academic establishment.
That's a subtlety that often gets missed. They saw the Protestant universities as basically just replacing the old Catholic Aristotelian prison with a new, equally rigid Protestant scholastic system.
Another intellectual prison.
Exactly, an intellectual hardening that prevented real spiritual progress. So their third way, this idea of a kind of Protestant magic, offered an escape route.
What defined this Protestant magic, though?
It was an attempt to re-enchant the world in a way. Post-Reformation Protestantism had stripped away a lot of the old Catholic mystery, the sacraments, the sense of divine presence in matter. The Rosicrucian program tried to reclaim that sense of divine immanence, that God was physically present and active in the world by using Paracelsian medicine and Kabbalistic wisdom.
So trying to heal the splits.
They sought to heal the intellectual and religious divisions by proposing a philosophy that could transcend the existing binaries, Catholic, Protestant, faith, reason, and make science itself a path back to the sacred.
It's a powerful vision, utopian, timely. But the sheer scale of the reaction, that furor, must have relied heavily on the revolutionary technology of the era, too.
Oh, undoubtedly. The printing press was the engine of the furor. You have these radical, anonymous texts that could suddenly bypass the traditional gatekeepers, the universities, the church authorities, and speak directly to a growing, sophisticated, literate public spread across Europe.
Anonymity plus print.
That combination created arguably the world's first truly viral esoteric phenomenon.
So it wasn't a controlled debate among scholars in Latin.
Not at all. It was an uncontrolled public spectacle, mostly in German and other vernaculars. Anyone could publish a response, defending the Brotherhood, attacking them, desperately seeking them, which led to literally hundreds of pamphlets exploding across European cities.
So the public conversation was just fragmented, chaotic, fueled by hope and fear.
Completely. It was an intellectual free-for-all, and nobody was really in charge of the narrative.
And it's really important, I think, to connect this context back to the eventual outcome. This utopian project, launched in 1614 to provoke inner reform and usher in a golden age. It was followed almost immediately by the outbreak of the catastrophic 30 Years' War in 1618.
The irony is just crushing, isn't it? The war completely shattered those optimistic millenarian hopes that had fueled the movement in the first place. André's later classification of the Brotherhood as a ludibrium really has to be understood in that context. It sounds like a deeply frustrated, tragic postscript, a grand dream utterly destroyed by the very physical chaos the movement had sought to prevent through spiritual means.
So the manifestos didn't actually found an organization, but they definitely founded a continent-wide, chaotic public debate that lasted for years. Let's look at that reaction, say, between 1614 and 1620. How did the intellectual world actually process this anonymous call?
Well, we can roughly categorize the intellectual responses into three main camps.
Yeah.
You had the proponents, the detractors, and maybe the seekers.
Okay, the proponents first. The mystical wing. People who bought in.
Right. These were intellectuals who immediately recognized the Rosicrucian message as maybe the urgently needed answer to the crisis of knowledge they were feeling.
And the most famous of these was Robert Fludd.
Yeah.
Right? The influential English Paracelsian physician.
Fludd was probably their most vigorous public offender, yeah. He wrote these passionate, incredibly elaborate works like the Apologia Compendiaria, arguing that the Brotherhood was absolutely genuine, divinely inspired, and basically the only hope for a fractured Europe.
What was his argument?
Fludd himself was deeply versed in Hermeticism, Kabbalah, alchemy. He saw their philosophy as the true science, perfectly illustrating the complex mystical correspondences between the macrocosm, the universe, and the microcosm man. He just accepted the revelation wholesale. And he argued their invisibility simply confirmed their superiority to the mundane world.
Okay. And we also have Michael Mayer, the alchemist. He provided more of a mythological defense.
Yeah, Mayer, who was actually a court physician to Emperor Rudolph II, framed the whole Rosicrucian project in purely mythological and very complex alchemical terms. He defended their secrecy by arguing that invisibility was necessary to protect these divine secrets from the profane, the unworthy. He turned the ideas into these elaborate visual allegories, often publishing complex engravings with his defenses.
Fascinating. Okay, but on the other side, you had the detractors, mounting powerful critiques. But the key thing here is that the critiques weren't just coming from the old guard, the entrenched Aristotelians. They also came from within the new science movement itself.
That's critical, yes. The case of Andreas Libavius is really instructive here.
Who was he?
Libavius was a respected German physician and academic, but crucially, he was himself a proponent of Paracelsianism and the new chemistry.
So this was an internal battle for the soul of the emerging Enlightenment.
You could definitely see it that way. Libavius attacked the Rosicrucians not because they used chemistry or alchemy, but because of their methodology and their secrecy.
What was his specific objection then?
He supported the science of alchemy. He wanted to make it respectable, But he vehemently attacked the Brotherhood's anonymity, their really strong apocalyptic tone, and what he called their diabolical syncretism, this mixing of magic, Kabbalah, and Christianity.
Why diabolical?
Libavius was part of a movement trying to make alchemy a respectable, systematic, empirical discipline, something suitable for university teaching. He feared that these anonymous, revolutionary, mystical zealots would completely discredit the entire Paracelsian project in the eyes of the established authorities. Make it look like dangerous nonsense.
Ah,
Yeah.
okay. So the core tension was systematic, maybe even proto-empirical science, versus this mystical, hermetic, revealed science.
Precisely. Libavius wanted structured knowledge that could be peer-reviewed, taught openly. The Rosicrucians offered veiled revelation and demanded internal transformation. This division really foreshadows that eventual split between the rational, mechanical philosophy that came to dominate and the older, mystical, natural philosophy.
But perhaps the most intellectually significant reaction in the long run was that of a seeker who failed to find the Brotherhood, René Descartes.
Ah, Descartes. His story is perhaps the most pivotal intellectual irony of the whole era. The sources confirm that in 1619, while he was stationed in Germany as a soldier, the young French philosopher was actively and earnestly searching for the invisible college.
He was looking for them. Why?
He was seeking their promised new universal science, that Philosophia Reformata they hinted at. He wanted the infallible unified method that could synthesize all knowledge and overcome the radical doubt he felt about everything.
So he was looking for the answer to the crisis of knowledge that the manifestos had so skillfully articulated.
He absolutely was, and his famous failure to find them fundamentally altered the course of Western thought.
How so?
Having failed to locate this magical syncretic method that could bridge the gap between faith and reason, he basically concluded that if the infallible method wasn't already secretly out there, well, he'd just have to invent it himself.
Wow. So this is the moment when the Rosicrucian failure, in a way, directly necessitated the birth of the Cartesian project. Rationalism.
Yeah. You could argue that very strongly, yes. Descartes retreated to his famous stove-heated room and began building his own system from the ground up based on the one thing he felt he could trust: mathematical certainty and radical rationalism.
A very different path.
Completely different. The Rosicrucians had offered revelation through allegory and observing nature. Descartes offered method through logical deduction. The manifestos had sought to unite faith and reason magically. Descartes separated them radically, creating that mind-body duality that defines so much of modern philosophy.
So the Rosicrucian call, through its failure to provide a tangible answer, inadvertently launched the mechanical age.
It forced the intellectual pivot, you could say. It made the search for a new, unifying method so urgent that when the mystical option seemed to fail, the rationalist option had to be invented to fill the void.
Meanwhile, the public furor reached its peak hysteria in a very visible way in Paris in 1623. Tell us about that.
Ah, yes, the Paris placards. This was wild. Anonymous posters suddenly appeared literally all over the city, boldly announcing that the Brothers of the Rosy Cross were present among them, traveling visibly and invisibly.
That must have terrified people.
Oh, it was pure terror to a nervous, suspicious populace, especially in Catholic Paris.
And the result of these placards?
Immediate, wide-scale moral panic. The myth, which had been maybe more of an abstract intellectual curiosity for German scholars, instantly transformed into this terrifying societal bogeyman. Pamphlets exploded, accusing these invisibles of being demonic sorcerers, political subversives, existential threats to the Catholic kingdom.
So the Rosicrucian myth became the template for conspiracy theories.
Absolutely. It became the template for basically every subsequent paranoid conspiracy theory about powerful, hidden organizations manipulating events behind the scenes.
It's just astonishing how quickly a utopian call for intellectual reform turns into a catalyst for mass hysteria and paranoia when you combine it with that powerful, uncontactable concept of anonymity.
It really speaks to the power of the concept itself, the idea of the hidden hand. The complete lack of verifiable fact meant people could just project their deepest fears onto the empty vessel the authors had created. So, as we discussed, the 30 Years' War basically shattered the original utopian project, that dream of a general reformation. It just didn't happen. The myth, however, proved absolutely immortal.
Right. The myth endured precisely because the organization was invisible, a ludibrium, as Andre called it. Since no one could point to a physical headquarters or a membership ledger, there was literally nothing for war or persecution to destroy.
Exactly. The Brotherhood became this empty, incredibly powerful, symbolic blueprint that subsequent generations could pick up, claim, and fill with their own aspirations and interpretations.
And this symbolic blueprint, it went underground for a while,
Yeah.
but then re-emerged powerfully in the 18th century through a crucial graft onto another burgeoning phenomenon, Freemasonry.
Yes, Freemasonry was developing its own esoteric structures at the time.
And that transition from a public call to a formal initiatory system seems really key here. As Freemasonry developed its elaborate system of high degrees beyond the basic craft lodge.
They needed deeper, more esoteric content to attract the intellectual elites, right? And this led directly to the creation of the Rose-Croix degree, usually the 18th degree of the Scottish Rite system.
The Rose-Croix. So they took the name and symbolism.
They deliberately incorporated the symbolism of the rose, representing maybe the soul or enlightenment, on the cross, representing the challenges of material life. They fused it with Christian, chivalric, and alchemical themes, often emphasizing Christ's resurrection.
So the Rosicrucian call for internal reformation was transformed into a visible, formal, initiatory structure.
Exactly. It became a kind of cascade of legitimacy for a Masonic elite who were seeking deeper spiritual meaning within their fraternity.
Okay, then we move into the 19th century, during that great European occult revival. And the focus seems to shift back to refounding Rosicrucianism as a scholarly, maybe separate society, independent of the main Masonic structure, though often drawing members from it.
Right. The pivotal revivalist project here was the Societas Rosicruciana in Anglia, the SRIA, founded in England in 1866.
And what was their focus?
This was an exclusive, quite scholarly body, restricted entirely to high-ranking Master Masons. Its focus was explicitly academic, studying the original manifestos, the Kabbalah, Hermeticism, alchemy. They saw themselves as the direct custodians of that 17th century intellectual lineage.
And the SRAA acted as the direct seedbed, didn't it, for the most famous magical order of the era, the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, founded in 1888.
Absolutely. The Golden Dawn essentially internalized the Rosicrucian myth completely. Their complex structure placed the core Rosicrucian initiation, what they called the inner order, or second order, right at the center of their spiritual curriculum.
How did they do that?
The key ritual for entering that inner order was a direct, highly theatrical reenactment of the discovery of Christian Rosenkreuz's seven-sided tomb, exactly as it was described back in the Fama Fraternitatis. They literally used the 17th century manifesto as the script for their highest spiritual transformation ritual.
Incredible. Okay, now we enter the 20th century,
Wow.
and the Rosicrucian idea seems to explode into the mass market. And this leads to what you call the Great Schism in lineage claims.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. The most visible, certainly the most geographically expansive modern organization using the name is the ancient mystical order Rosicrucis, or AORC, founded in 1915 by H. Spencer Lewis.
And AMRC moved away from that Masonic requirement.
Completely. It became a mass market, public-facing organization delivering its teachings largely via correspondence courses, eventually reaching a global audience.
But AMRC represents what you term the perennialist model, which fundamentally breaks with the idea that the 17th century manifestos are the origin point, right?
Exactly. This is the core of the schism. The perennialist claim, championed by AMRC, is that there's an unbroken lineage stretching back millennia, often traced to the secret wisdom schools of ancient Egypt, sometimes linking directly to Pharaoh Akhenaten.
Akhenaten, really?
That's the claim. In this view, the 17th century manifestos are merely one public restatement, just one historical appearance of a primordial tradition that has always existed, secretly preserved through the ages.
Is there historical evidence for that lineage?
Well, it's historically unverifiable. The academic sources show no demonstrable link between Akhenaten's Egypt and 17th century castle. But that narrative, that claim to ancient roots, proved incredibly appealing to a modern audience seeking deep historical legitimacy and connection to antiquity.
So we have these two fundamentally incompatible modern streams using the Rosicrucian name.
Basically, yes. You have the revivalist groups tracing their lineage through Organizations like the SRIA and the Golden Dawn, who generally see the 17th century texts as the foundational source document and the core intellectual basis. And then you have the perennialists like AMRC and also other groups like Max Heindel's Rosicrucian Fellowship, which blended the myth with theosophy, who claim a much more ancient lineage that simply utilized the manifestos as a temporary vehicle in 1614.
So they both use the symbol, the name, but they tell completely different historical stories about its origin and significance.
Precisely. And today, the symbol itself, that image of the rose unfolding on the cross, has become this potent, floating signifier. It stands for the search to synthesize mysticism and reason, the heart and the mind. Even in its failure to achieve the literal general reformation, the Rosicrucian project provided the perfect, enduring symbolic language for that ongoing quest. So, if we try to synthesize all this, the Rosicrucian Manifestos were this high-stakes, absolutely pivotal gamble in Western thought. They were arguably the final, magnificent attempt to unify that entire pre-modern magical cosmology, Kabbalah, Hermeticism, Paracelsian alchemy, with the dawning new science, desperately hoping to prevent the schism that was threatening to tear Europe apart.
And we keep coming back to Andre's idea of the ludibrium, the serious game. The authors constructed a conscious fiction, the Invisible Brotherhood, in this desperate pedagogical attempt to create an intellectual and spiritual reality, the General Reformation. They wanted to fix the world by provoking an internal intellectual shift in every worthy seeker who read their words.
And their tragic miscalculation was just so profoundly human, wasn't it? They created a myth so compelling, so intriguing, that the audience obsessed over the myth's literal existence. Where are they? How do I join? And almost entirely ignored the urgent spiritual and intellectual work the myth actually demanded of them.
Yeah. The world chose the rational Cartesian path instead. The General Reformation of 1614 failed. It led not to a golden age, but to decades of absolutely devastating war. Yet, maybe the most powerful legacy of the manifestos is precisely their failure to be literal. By providing this symbolic blueprint for an ideal, perhaps unattainable society, they created an enduring philosophical riddle. They forced every seeker, from Descartes wondering where they were, to those Golden Dawn initiates acting out the tomb ritual, to define Reformation for themselves.
Absolutely. The symbol of the Rosy Cross remains powerful because the challenge it represents, the healing of that divide between the rational mind and the intuitive heart, between science and faith, well, it remains largely unanswered, doesn't it? The authors essentially provided this perfect, empty box for human utopian hope, and the world has been filling it, interpreting it, and arguing about it ever since.
We've traced the incredible reach of just 3 short, anonymous pamphlets. From sparking a continent-wide social panic, influencing the very foundations of modern rationalism, to creating the definitive blueprint for virtually all modern occult and secret societies. That is an unbelievable legacy for a group that, as a literal club, probably never even existed.
The influence was always in the idea, not the organization. The idea was the powerful thing.
So here is a final provocative thought for you, our listener, to mull over as you continue your own deep dive. If the authors of the Rosicrucian Manifestos were using the myth of an invisible college to provoke an intellectual shift in you, a serious game intended to bypass the stagnant institutions of their time, what modern invisible colleges, maybe what widespread anonymous myths or digital movements today, are trying to spark a necessary reformation in our current age? And are we, 4 centuries later, still potentially missing the point of the call, still focusing on the literal vehicle, the organization, the messenger, instead of the urgent inner work that the message demands?
That is something worth pondering indeed. The challenge, in many ways, remains the same.
That's our deep dive for today. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and definitely keep digging into the source material yourself. We'll talk to you next time on The Deep Dive.